Hello and welcome to Success is Never Accidental, the show where we get to explore all the factors that contribute to success, and I get to interview some highly successful people. My name is Lynne Peyton, and my guest today, Damon Davis, is based in Washington, D.C., and he's a healthcare innovator with over 20 years experience in health data, patient access to care, and reducing health disparities. But that's not what we're going to talk to him about today, because Damon is also a podcast host. He has two amazing podcasts, Discovery Diaries with Damon Davis, and the one we really want to focus in on today, Who Am I Really? A series of more than 200 episodes where Damon has talked to literally hundreds of people who have shared their stories of adoption and their attempts to find their birth families. So please help me welcome Damon Davis. Damon, thank you so much for joining us today from Washington, D.C.
Oh my goodness, Lynn, thanks so much for having me. It's really great to be connected with you again.
And it's such an honor to have you on this podcast. And I have to say, because you know a little bit about my background, I'm particularly intrigued by the things you're going to share with us today. So I know you have so many accomplishments, Damon, but today we agreed that we would focus on your podcast, Who Am I Really? And let's just kick right off by asking, what is the motivation? What was the motivation for you to interview all these hundreds of people about their stories and their journeys?
Absolutely. Thanks for the question. And so just to set the stage a little bit, I'm an adopted person. I'm also an adoptive parent, and I do a lot of work in the adoption space. And as an adoptee, when my son was born, he was the first biological relative that I had ever known in my entire life. And that was a really pivotal moment for me because growing up in adoption, you don't know much about your background in terms of any of your heredity. You don't know anything about your family's history. You just have a complete disconnection. And I think that people sometimes underestimate how challenging it can be to be adopted. And I think that one of the things that ends up happening for folks is they don't really recognize that a child has been transplanted from one family to another and is expected to grow up and be comfortable there. And so my podcast, Who Am I Really, is a collection of stories where I interview other adopted people like myself about their own journey through adoption and their attempts to find their biological family members. I've done 7 years of this show. It's been 230 episodes. And it's an astonishing array of stories about humanity. It's how well we can treat each other, the love we have for each other. It's a collection of stories about how ugly people can be to each other and how awful family structures can end up, really deteriorating. And so I'm, very, very fortunate for the experience that I've had both in adoption and reunion. And I'm happy to share a little bit more about it.
And in your book, you say adoption is such a complex scenario because there are three parties involved. There's the biological parents, there's the child, and then there's the adoptive parents. From my experience, because I have been the social worker to a mom who is considering and indeed did give her child up for adoption, I've also chaired the adoption panel for my area where we get to make those really complicated decisions about which children should be freed for adoption and for which children is adoption in their best interest, and also which couples are likely to be able to meet the needs of children who require adoptive parents. So I think there's another group of people that are really intrinsically involved in this process, and many of them will be listening to us today. So I think the things that you're going to share are such an education for people like me and my colleagues in the social care and healthcare sector. Mm-hmm. So in your interviews, what are some of the themes that have come up, Damon, that have made adoptions more likely to be successful?
Yeah, great question. I think for me, the things that come up often are themes around the adoptive parents' ability to accept that they've adopted a child and that that child is going to grow up and potentially want to seek out their birth identity one day. And something that I've often said in my time as an advocate and an interviewer and just living as an adoptee is that two things can exist at the same time in adoption. I can be extremely grateful and happy and loving for the adoptive family that I grew up with, and at the same time, be very curious about who my biological family is and potentially have for love for them too. So I can have love in both places. Two things can exist in the same time. I can live with the sort of gratitude of the experiences that I've had in adoption, but also wonder what might have happened if I had stayed with my biological family. So there's a lot of dichotomies that run at this exact same time in adoption. Some other things that come up for me are the underestimation of how challenging adoption is for certain people in terms of their consideration of who they are. Quite literally, that's why I called the podcast, Who Am I Really? Because you end up making this realization that you grew up in one family, but that you were born in another family, and you have no real understanding of what that underlying circumstance may have been, what the reasons for your placement in adoption may have been. A lot of themes come up in these interviews about mothers who were coerced, forced, felt like they had no choice, made to feel othered as a woman who was having a child out of wedlock, etc. And these are women who will tell you that they wished that they could have kept their child, but they just didn't feel like it was even possible because society at large said that they couldn't do it, because their father didn't like that guy from across the tracks and he was from the wrong side of town. And so we're not bringing that baby home with that person being the father. There's the mistake of, getting pregnant accidentally when you're, having a fling and a casual dalliance. And so there's all of these issues that arise from why a person is put up for adoption. Many adoptees feel fear of finding out that they were placed for adoption because they were the product of a violent act, for example, or that they were placed for adoption because of some other, incestual or other issues. So there's a lot of fear and concern among adoptees, but there's ultimately a genuine curiosity. People want to know who they are. And if anybody doubts that for any reason or can't understand why, I would challenge you to think about something like Ancestry DNA or 23andMe. There's millions and millions of people on those platforms, and not all of them are adopted. Many of them just want to know who they really are as it applies to global history, familial history. So when you take that in consideration of what an adoptee doesn't know about themselves, you can understand quite clearly why people want to know who they really are. In terms of other themes, I think there's a lot of synchronicity between adoptees and their biological families. It would surprise you the number of quote unquote coincidences that happen between an adopted person and their biological family members. I know for myself, I ended up going to the same historically Black college, Hampton University, that my birth mother, my birth father, and my uncle did in my biological family. I know stories of people who felt an unbelievable attraction to places like Ireland and Italy, and they ended up finding out that their biological family, different from what they were told, is actually from those places. And so there's this genetic pull to places around the world, to interesting activities. People are artists, they're jocks and sports people, they're bookworms and all this other stuff. And they don't even realize that the reason that they're different from their family is because they have a genetic linkage to some kind of interest that was in their biological family. So I see themes like that across these interviews.
It's just incredible, isn't it, that the universe actually pulls us in certain directions. I'm a great believer in the universe. I always say to people, at least tell it what you want and then allow it to kind of help put some of those factors in place. I was intrigued by a couple of the podcasts where people were demonstrating that curiosity, and beyond curiosity, a need to know about their biological family. And yet they described it as a stop-start process. It was like they went a little bit and then it was like they had to process what they'd learned before they could move on. Can you talk a little bit, Damon, about what it is that, and it's probably unique because every individual will handle it in their own way, but something about that it's a journey rather than, just a revelation, if you like.
Yeah, this is a really great point, because the decision to try to search for biological family happens for different people for different reasons at different times in our lives, right? So for me, as I alluded to in the beginning, when I was 36 years old, my son was born. And that was when I had my first biological relative I'd ever known in my entire life. For me, that was a pivotal moment. But for many young women, and I make the assumption that because a young woman knows that she can produce a child when she hits puberty, I believe that women start to think about searching for their biological families much earlier in their lives, because the reality of reproducing is something that we're taught in schools. I think that there are some kids that have sort of learned that they were adopted at what we'll call a late discovery adoptee age. So I just had a story recently of a woman who said she used to sit around watching television on Saturday morning, and she was watching her favorite show, and she's at, about 7 or 8 years old, and her parents come to her and reveal to her that she's adopted. Now, that's a news flash in a person's life, right? I knew that I was adopted from the time I was an infant. So I grew up with that knowledge. There was never this CNN breaking news story on my TV feed that said, hey, we've got news for you. You need to know you're adopted. And so the same thing can also happen for an adult late discovery adoptee, where that person finds out when their adoptive parents pass away, and they go to the attic and they start looking through papers, and they realize, oh my gosh, there's another child's name on this birth certificate, and that child's name has my birth date. I wonder if I'm adopted, right? And other things have happened. I've talked to people who've said that, the neighborhood day drinker would get a little tipsy, and they ended up revealing that the child is adopted. So there's all these ways that adoption is revealed to a person. And then the next piece is, where is that person in their life, and whether they have the ability to search for their biological family. For the 7-year-old who finds out on a Saturday morning, she probably has no idea what reunion looks like. How do I have any rights to try to find my family, and do they want to know me? So a child's brain is going to go through a certain examination of what's possible. An adult's brain is going to do something very different, right? I'm going to think about, if I'm a teenager, when I'm 18 years old, I'm definitely searching. I know I'm an adult. I have my rights. I will search at that time. Another adult might say, I don't have time for this right now. My mom's sick. I don't have the money for the search. My job is crazy hectic. I just can't do this right now. I'm going to push this search off for a while. So I say all that to say, in those loose examples, that there's a variety of different reasons why an individual might search, and different time frames at which some people will search.
But very interesting points there, that we've long known that telling children from infancy, before they're verbal, that they're adopted, and making that part of the conversation and naturalizing it, is the most effective way of helping children understand that they're adopted. But you suggest that it can be quite traumatic for people to learn later on, either in childhood, but in a way where it comes as a surprise, or particularly, I suppose, if they're an adult and they've grown up their whole life believing something that wasn't real.
Exactly.
How can helping agencies support people who are on the journey of either coming to terms as an adult with the fact that they're adopted, or in that search or that journey to find out who they really are? And those
Yeah, I think that
agencies could be either the tracing social worker or someone who's formally trained to do it, but it may come up in counselling or other kind of arrangements.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of pieces there. One is, and this is very, very hard to do, but I feel like part of it is the adoptee needs to do their own work to examine why they're searching in the first place. And this could come through formal means like therapy, or it may just be, a series of discussions with yourself as to why it is that you're searching. Because my belief is you need to be whole within yourself before you begin this journey. You shouldn't begin the journey to try to make yourself whole, because what will end up happening is if disappointment arises, if you find your biological family and they don't want to know you, if you find your biological family and things start off great and then they turn to crap, if you don't find your biological family at all, or let's say you find a grave, you're never going to speak to these people. Is it going to destroy you because you weren't able to get the answers you needed? And so I think that it's important for the adopted person themselves to do the work to recognize, I'm good with who I am. I recognize that a circumstance put me in this position to be adopted. And I realize that these are easy things to say, but there are some very, very, very challenging adoptions out there. There are some kids that are mistreated.
Yeah.
And it's really incredibly unfortunate because that child did not ask to come into this world. That child did not ask to be adopted. So for them to be mistreated in a family that did adopt them is unacceptable. So I think that there's a lot that the adopted person can do up front. In terms of the agency themselves, it's important to recognize these are humans, right? These are not commodities that we traded like cards from one family to another. These are people. Adoptees deserve to have some answers as to where they come from, what their heritage is, what their health and genetic background is, right? Think about the challenge of an individual. When we started talking, you were talking about your friend who lives with Alzheimer's. I need to know that Alzheimer's is something that's in my family. And if I don't have that, there's nothing that I can do without that knowledge to proactively inhibit the onset of Alzheimer's or some other chronic disease. If I have a propensity for type 2 diabetes in my family, I should know that. If I have a propensity for some level of cancer or any other genetic or hereditary issue, that is something that I absolutely should know. And so I think that the agencies need to recognize the humanness of what it is that they're involved with and do everything that they can to try to find and support families in reconnecting and let whatever's going to happen happen. It's not up to them to dictate that. This is something that the people who find each other need to figure out on their own. And I think there's a final piece there that has kind of gone unsaid, which is that the biological parents, I believe, need to be in a position of recognizing what happened in the past and recognizing that the past is the past and hopefully opening themselves up to at least a conversation with the adoptee about their story, what happened, and where we are now. Because I like to think of it, I heard one of the adoptees that I interviewed say, adopted people don't know chapter 1 of their story. Every adopted person's story basically starts in chapter 2. I know the story from the moment I was brought home as an adoptee going forward, but I don't know, for example, personally, I have no idea where I was for the first 3 months of my life when I lived in adoption. I have zero concept of where I was. I didn't until reunion know anything about what my circumstances were. Who was my birth mother? Why was I placed for adoption, or any of that initial story? So I think that there's an important component there, which is the past is in the past. The biological family needs to recognize there is a person out there that is genetically related to them. They are going to want to come back and at least have a conversation. you should open yourself up to the possibility that that person is returning and prepare yourself for that conversation and go ahead and have it. And then you can decide if you want to have a relationship with that person or not.
And almost you're sort of advocating that anybody who's in any of those positions start asking themselves the questions now before the actual contact takes place. So a biological parent who gave up a child for whatever reason needs to let go of the self-judgment, the self-blame, the blame and the anger against other people that were involved, and open them up to the possibility that their child, son or daughter, might reach out to them in the not too distant future, and start to have the conversation so they're ready. So much poignancy in everything that you said there, Damon. But some of the things I heard were, from the adoptive child's point of view, there's a personal responsibility, adoptive child who is now an adult, there's a personal responsibility to both work on yourself and to consider the options and to do the work so that you become more emotionally resilient to cope with whatever might come up, and also to be prepared to be the person who's more ready to have the discussion if you actually do find your biological parent. Now that's tough, that's asking a lot, but I can see the sense in that. And I think the messages for the helping agencies was to really connect, empathize with what the journey has been like. And we're trained to do that, but also we can't determine the pace. The helping agencies have to listen to understand, have to really connect with what's going on for this person, and have to be there to support them in their time frames.
Yes.
And it's a bit about, it's really coaching rather than mentoring, isn't it? It's because it's facilitating those conversations that you say people need to have with themselves.
That's right.
Really, really. But then tell us about, and I just want to put in a plug for your book there, Who Am I Really? An Adoptee Memoir, because you put all the chapter 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 together, looking backwards when you have the information, which makes it such a fascinating read. I haven't finished it yet, but the early chapters are gripping just by the way that you kind of narrate the story. So definitely a wonderful read, and really looking forward to the next edition, where you really build on some of the things we've talked about today, Damon, which is what has been the learning from all of the interviews that you've conducted with people today. When can we expect the book?
Nah, that's a great question. I wish I knew the answer to that. It's a long journey. So to set the stage for the second book, and maybe I'll talk about the first book first. The first book is my own story. That's quite literally, who am I, really? And I loved what you said. You picked up on what I was trying to do, was introduce my chapter 1 before we get to my own story. And I recognized in writing my first book that my story started before I was even conceived, that there were people who were growing into adulthood who were trying to find their own way. 1, a woman who got pregnant accidentally. 2, a young man who fell in love with a young woman and they got married, but then unfortunately realized that they couldn't have children. And so the connection between this young woman who's pregnant unexpectedly and this young family who's trying to start but can't conceive ends up leading to an adoption. So I tell my birth mother, my adoptive mother, and my adoptive father's stories first to introduce you to who they were and how they got to the point where their stories connected. And then I introduce myself. So I appreciate you recognizing that that was what I tried to narrate. The second book is going to be quite different. As I started off telling you, I've been doing this for 7 years, 230 plus episodes, and way more to come. I've got a nice list of people who want to be on the show because there's so many unique stories to tell. And what I realized was, after talking to this many adoptees, I basically have accidentally assembled a research cohort of adopted people, folks who have an array of adopted perspectives and who have shared their knowledge and their own personal journeys with me. And in doing so, they've basically articulated a variety of different ways that adoption comes together. the reasons people are placed for adoption, the reasons people decide they want to search for their biological families, the methods that they take to actually execute the search, how the reunion goes. How does it go with a birth mother and how does it go with a birth father? And how do you talk about this journey with your adoptive family, whom many people are, expecting some loyalty, are surprised by a search, etc. So all of that to say, the next book, I'm synthesizing all of these stories from across the array of interviews to talk about what the adoption experience is. And then I'm going to infuse quotes from the podcast to corroborate what I've said is my learning, right? If you were an adoptee, I would say, many adoptees search for their biological fathers for the following reasons. Like Lynne said in episode 28, where she talked about, and I would put your quote. So it's going to be a long journey. I'm super excited about it. It's a lot of fun to put it together, especially because I'm going to take time and revisit every single podcast to pull out some of the nuggets that are going to really highlight and underscore the adoptee experiences that I've articulated. So it's my expectation that later this year I'll have some big news in terms of the next book coming out.
And this is not what the podcast was about, but as a journal editor of many years, I would advocate that you think about done is better than perfect. 2 volumes might be better than 1. Do not deprive people of the learning that you already have by trying to make it perfect and include all the stories, because it sounds to me like there could be volume 1 to whatever of what you're doing, but that it might be an amazing and additional contribution to what you've already done if you can
That's a great point.
get
That's a
some
great
of that
point. I've had someone else tell me, you might not want to put this all in one book. This might be multiple volumes. And so I may need to think that through, because just the journey to find a biological mother alone can be very different than finding a biological father, right? Every single biological mother out there knows that she is a biological mother. But for the biological fathers, it's possible they don't know, right? And so there's a very different story to be told there. So if nothing else, I could divide the book in 2 just on that alone. So it would be interesting to see how we do on that.
Or you could just share what you know already and build on it in volume.
Yeah.
And so what I'm thinking is this is not just about people who support adoptees and biological parents and adopters and prospective adopters. All of this is about human interest. Your podcasts are simply human interest stories. They are poignant, heartwarming, emotional. I cried at one. They're very, very moving and just a beautiful listening experience. So how do people find you, Damon, and find the podcast?
Thanks so much for the compliments. You nailed exactly what I was trying to accomplish. So you can find me at Damon L. Davis on Instagram. You can find the podcast, which is called Who Am I Really, online. It's whoamireallypodcast.com. It's on all the major podcast platforms, and you can follow the show on Instagram at WAI Really. Who Am I Really? So lots of online presence, hundreds of stories, and hundreds more to come. So thank you so much, Lynne, for having me here today.
And thank you for sharing your amazing contribution. And I can't finish without letting people know that this amazing man is also now an adoptive parent as well as a biological parent. That's a whole other story, Damon, and maybe we'll do that another day. But for now, my friend, thank you so much for joining us.
Of course, Lynne. Thanks for having me. I appreciate being on your platform. This is amazing.
There is no one better placed to tell us about life as an adopted child and as an adoptive adult than Damon Davis. He's the author of Who Am I Really, an adoption memoir, and the host of a podcast of the same name, in which he has interviewed more than 230 adoptees over a period of 7 years. Damon is currently working on a second book that will capture the insights, challenges, humor, sadness, and poignancy of the combined experiences and illustrative illustrative of how individual and unique each adoptee's story really is. He reminds us of the complexity of adoption, not just because of the triad of relationships involved, but the diverse circumstances that contribute to a birth parent's decision to give up a child for adoption, and also the circumstances leading to someone's application to provide an adoptive home. Damon encourages helping agencies to not underestimate the impact of what he called transplanting a child. He believes that while many adoptees are driven to find out about their origins, it can be a perilous journey, and it takes time and it takes emotional resilience. And he shared with us the following really important insights for all involved. He advocated that adoptees should take personal responsibility to work on themselves so they're ready for whatever they uncover. They need to ask themselves what it is they want from the search, they need to consider the potential outcomes, and then they need to be emotionally capable of handling whatever shows up. He also advocates that biological parents should anticipate that their child may come looking for them, and they should be able to let go of the past, let go of the self-blame, let go of the self-judgment, so that they are in a space where they can be reunited. He also said that it's important for adoptive parents to help by understanding and recognizing that their child has the capacity to both love and be grateful to them for providing a home while still needing to know chapter 1 of their own story. And he suggested that professionals in helping agencies need to be understanding, nurturing, empathetic, and willing to coach and support adoptees on their terms and allow them to go at their own pace. Follow Damon on LinkedIn, on Who Am I Really podcast on Spotify and other channels, and look for his memoir, which is available on Amazon. So many factors contribute to successful adoptions and to the successful reunion of adoptees with their birth parents, while still maintaining the love and attachment to their adoptive families. But remember, success in anything is never accidental.